Right, are we ready then? Wait for the little red sign. Good afternoon, Fastamai everyone, and welcome to this public meeting of the House of Keys Select Committee on Tobacco and Nicotine Products. I'm Dr Michelle Hayward, MHK, and I chair this committee, and with me are Joni Farragher, MHK, and Stu Peters, MHK. Before we begin, can you please make sure that mobile phones are turned off or on silent? And today we'll be taking evidence from Mr Mark Smith, who is Head of the Office of Fair Trading. Welcome. And for the benefit of Hansard and anyone listening, could you please introduce yourself, giving your job title and how long you've been in your current role?
Okay. I'm Mark Smith. I'm the Head of the Office of Fair Trading. I've been in post since November and I've been with the Office of Fair Trading since January last year. So. Thank you.
Thank you for the detailed written submission that you provided to the committee in December last year. Following on from that, we'd like to ask you some questions about matters that you raised there and related issues. So for starters, I'm going to hand over to Mr Peters.
Yeah, current regulations on the Isle of Man. For background, what regulations are currently in place regarding the sale of tobacco products on the Isle of Man?
Okay. At the moment, we've got the Vaping Products Act, the Public Health Tobacco Act 2026, Tobacco Control Regulations 2015, which primarily cover the display ban. We've got the Children and Young Persons Act 1966, the Children and Young Persons Display Regulations from 2000, which primarily cover the display of warning statements, and the Children and Young Persons Act 1999, which covers the sale of addictive and intoxicating substances.
So plenty of legislation then around it?
There's plenty of legislation at the moment, yes.
Okay. With the Vaping Products Act 2024 coming into force recently, what role does the Office of Fair Trading have in enforcement?
We were involved in bringing in the age restriction for vaping, so we were involved in educating retailers with the change in the law, because tobacco was age restricted before this, but the vapes weren't age restricted. So that piece of legislation gave us a duty to go and educate and advise retailers that there was now an age restriction on that product. Then as we moved forward through the calendar year last year, we came towards the display ban. So from the 1st of September, we were heavily involved in the run-up to that and advising retailers on how to prepare for the ban, giving out advice on the types of displays and the way they could have the vape removed from site in preparation for the display ban. So we gave advice to retailers to allow them to make the correct decisions on the type of equipment and the display cabinets and things like that they needed to meet the display ban.
Okay, do you think that regulations on tobacco and nicotine products have been successful objectively on the Isle of Man with regards to their operation? I sometimes worry that, I use a vape, and if I go into a petrol station, I want to buy some fluid, I can't see it. So I can't ask whether or not they've got the type that I want. You know, fella's got to come and unlock the cabinet and all. You know, is that working, or is it just there to confound people?
It seems to be working. We're not receiving any complaints. We're not getting any pushback from the retailers. I think they're used to it. I think with tobacco having come first, I think it was a fairly easy transition to add vapes onto that. It can be complicated, obviously, because sometimes it's a little bit different when you're selecting a vape to tobacco. Quite often with tobacco products, people have got a favourite product. So they're used to just picking the same brand and going with the same product once they've decided they're happy with that. But with vapes, people quite often change the flavours and things like that. They make different decisions at different times, and they may even have more than one product that they like to have at one time. So.
Okay, but the fact that everything is now covered up, is that reducing the sales of vape products, or is it restricting the wrong sort of people from buying them, or...?
At the moment, well, to give you a summary, in the initial run-up to it, we were curious to know if this was going to have an effect. When the display ban came in, a lot of retailers in those first few weeks were telling us that they were seeing sales drop down dramatically. It possibly just be out of sight, out of mind, people going into shops, not seeing the product readily available. That was one thing that I had put down for one of my notes at the end, was to speak to the committee to see if they wanted some sort of survey done at retail level, just to see. I myself was curious. We're at the 6 months point on that. it'd be interesting to see what across the island sales were like now, and to do a little bit of feedback. I'd probably suggest we do that with public health. Maybe Office of Fair Trading could make up some questions and offer that across to public health, get a little bit of input and some feedback, and then do a little survey and then feed back into the committee. That was one of my thoughts and offers that I was going to make at the end.
So, following the regulations, it's probably too early to decide from talking to retailers whether there's been an effect or not just yet. Is that a fair comment?
I think the time might be right. We're 6 months in now. I think what's possibly happened in those first few weeks was what I was alluding to a minute ago, is that everything's changed. So we were aware of the forthcoming legislation, the retailers were aware of it, but the public possibly weren't, in different age groups, different reasons. They go into a shop and the product's not there anymore. Then they learn to ask for it because it's moved. Some shops it was quite dramatic. We were going into, everything was just out of sight and it was under the counter or in a cupboard, maybe adding a little bit of confusion to people when they're making their purchasing choices. But over time, they've realised that they've just got to ask for the product now. So yeah, I think now might be a nice time to do a little bit of retail feedback on that, if that's the kind of information the committee would like.
Okay. Any problems with compliance amongst retailers?
No. We took a 3-visit approach with, as well as some educational visits to it. So in the run-up to the display ban, we offered advice and assistance and gave out guidance. With the 2-week window before, we popped in to make sure everybody was prepared for compliance. And then in the 2-week window after the ban came in, we did a 3rd visit to every retailer just to make sure compliance was met. So it wasn't a particularly difficult piece of legislation to meet. There was no requirements to spend money on any expensive cabinets or anything. You did have other options available to you. Bigger retailers obviously did spend money on gantries and displays, very similar to tobacco, but as you drop down the scale maybe to independent sole traders, the options there just to put the items out of sight and retrieve them from a drawer that they may have owned was already there. So compliance was as close as I can imagine. I would call it 100%, but it was only because we didn't encounter any problems when we did our own visits and we got no calls or complaints from the public. So
a lot of work for the OFT. I mean, in rough numbers, how many vape retailers are there around the island?
We have 72 premises that sell tobacco and vaping products, of which 61 of those 72 premises sell both products. 9 sell exclusively vapes and 2 sell exclusively tobacco. So basically, you're looking at 72 premises is on our list, our office list. So it's a fair bit of work, but we didn't get much pushback at all. And as I said earlier, I think the fact that the tobacco legislation came first meant that this was just not something that they were sort of used to doing, and it was just a different product. So
no real pushback from the trade then. What about from members of the public? Any feedback from them?
I haven't had any feedback directly. Haven't really received any complaints either. Again, I think from this piece of legislation, I think we're lucky that it's almost mirrored tobacco legislation, and it's obviously sort of related field, so it's helped. So.
There are quite a lot of innovations in this field, it seems. Things like snus pouches and things like that. From the perspective of the OFT, would current regulations withstand new innovations in tobacco and nicotine products? Are you able to flex if somebody comes out with a new method of taking nicotine?
Not with the current legislation, but I think if there was the new legislation, drafts of it, and the sort of legislation that's being proposed and the sort of ideas that are put into new bits of legislation to deal with nicotine products, because you do get, as well as vapes and tobacco, obviously you get chewing products and things like that. We're seeing nicotine appearing in many different novel ways, and I think we would need new legislation to help cover that. There's no doubt about that. It's just the nature of it at the moment. It's a very varied marketplace. We're seeing multiple different types of product coming on.
I've got no personal knowledge of this, but apparently you can now get tobacco heating products. So, that heats rather than burns tobacco. So are you aware of that? And is that sort of thing a problem?
I'm aware of it, yes. We had, in my previous role when I was working in Scotland, we had that debate as well, the difference between vaping, the heating of tobacco, the burning of tobacco, the different ways it produced vapour clouds, its classification, primarily for smoking ban laws as well, the way tobacco was burnt and the way it created a plume, for that want of a better word. So yes, I'm aware there's multiple different products and they're always looking to create and regenerate. So.
Okay, and finally from me, is the island's tobacco and nicotine sales market mature and transparent? Is the right balance struck between enforcement and consumer choice?
At the present, yes, we're not receiving complaints in that area. I think we would need new legislation that's been proposed to tackle some of the issues that we've been debating, but we're not receiving lots of complaints and we feel powerless at the moment. But if you look across to the UK and some of the proposals there to tackle the different types of labelling issues and nicotine issues, tank size, volume and stuff like that, then yes, we would need new legislation to tackle that. I think the underage sale aspect of it and the display aspect of it is one bit of legislation, but we don't want products that can't be sold in other markets coming to the Isle of Man. So we don't want stuff that can't be sold anywhere else in the world suddenly piling up in the Isle of Man, and we don't have the legislation to tackle it, and we end up with a lot of unwanted stock being sold. So.
Okay, I'll hand over to Ms Farragher.
Thank you. First of all, Mr Smith. I've just got some questions on the tobacco and vape retail register. Because we understand that at present the Isle of Man doesn't have a requirement for retailers of tobacco or nicotine products to register before they sell their products, and also that there was an introduction of a register in Scotland in 2010 for tobacco and later in 2016 for vapes. Do you think that the island could or should follow suit with our counterparts in Scotland and create a tobacco and vapes retail register?
I think it would help. Whether you made it a criminal offence not to register would be for debate, but you could have a duty placed in legislation on people to notify the OFT of their wish to sell these products. It would certainly help the department, it would certainly help the flow of information, it would raise the level of expectation placed on retailers to take the sale of these products seriously. It would allow us to email out information to them. It would allow us to advise them on forthcoming legislation, any legislative changes. It would allow us to advise them on perhaps a product that was in the marketplace that was being offered around the island or online that we wanted them to be aware that was either unsafe for sale or unsuitable for sale for various reasons. It would allow them an opportunity to have direct contact and reach out to us for business advice. So there's many advantages of it. So yes, I do think it would be beneficial to put some duty on the retailers. It would also allow, if you pushed it further and you looked at the aspect of the offences of the sale of vaping and tobacco products that weren't from a retailer, it could add an offence there for people perhaps to sell it from a private address unregistered. So that was something that the Scottish Tobacco Register covered as well. So the unregistered sale of tobacco was an offence. So therefore, if you hadn't duly notified the Tobacco Register of your intention to sell these products, you were committing an offence. So that also meant, the private address failure to register would be an offence. So often, if there was allegations or complaints about sale of tobacco or vaping products from private addresses, that would be something that you could hold a discussion with the resident with in regards to their activity and explain to them at an advisory level the kind of duties that would be placed on them if they wished to sell these products. And it had many different benefits that helped the enforcement side of things. So.
Thanks, that's great. What do you think the impact would be? So you've answered some of that question in terms of what the benefits might be, but what do you think the impact would be of introducing a register on the island in terms of, let's look at things like cost of setting up and the charges to retailers, for example?
I don't see it being particularly onerous from that point of view. I mean, at the end of the day, if they're buying tobacco products, they'll probably be subject to the track and trace under customs and excise. so they're already used to registering for the safe transition and monitoring of their products coming from wholesalers. So for them to add an additional duty on to notify whether it be the OFT or public health of the fact that they intend to sell these products, it's just a registration. It's not particularly onerous. It's just notification usually. And if we were to introduce one, it was via a website where you filled out a form and an application, or just registered online and received a confirmation email, or whether they had to phone, notify or email us and have a form sent out, completed and returned. I think retailers are used to that now, so I don't think it would be particularly onerous on them, and it would be very helpful to both parties as well. So.
Thank you. Do you think that trading standards would be sufficiently enforced to enforce legislation regarding a tobacco and vape retail register and carry out an education piece to registered retailers?
When you say enforced, do you mean resourced?
Resourced, that's what I think.
Sorry. Sufficiently enforced to enforce legislation.
Resourced to enforce. Sorry.
Did I say it wrong? Apologies. I've obviously mispronounced something there. My apologies.
Do you want to try that one again so that it's clear?
Yes. Do you think that the Office of Fair Trading would be sufficiently resourced to enforce legislation creating a tobacco and vape retail register and to carry out an educational piece for retailers?
I don't think you can ever have too many resources, but I do feel at the moment we've got a team, we've got staff, and if the law of the land was to change, yes, we're engaging with them. But if you want to move to the next level and you want to look at the publication of training equipment and manuals, and if you want to upskill retailers, especially at a lower level where they're perhaps needing things like training records, refusal records, maybe a training video. One of the things we may come to later in discussions is a duty placed on the retailer to have an age verification policy. That's for identification of people under 25 but over 18. They're going to be IDing people. So we would need our team at the OFT to be going out and speaking to these retailers and educating them. It'd be nice to be able to furnish them with some quality literature at that point. And maybe even spend a little bit of time with them, just giving them examples of how to train their staff and how to fill out this material. We're fortunate we've got a lot of national level retailers on the island, but we do have a lot of sole traders that would probably really benefit from quality publications. So yes, a little bit of extra resourcing to help from that point of view would certainly be beneficial. But we do have staff, and we did manage to cope with the vaping legislation. So it would be just on the scale of how thorough and professional and how much literature and materials that we could hand out. But yes, fundamentally, staffing wise, yes, we have the resources, but obviously we'd like to do a thorough job and leave people with training materials that they could use, learn from, and interact with their own staff. And basically we don't want to enforce through prosecutions or anything. We just want to educate to avoid enforcement action. So the more interaction and literature and the more visits and time we spend with retailers, similar to the vaping implementation ban, the three-pronged visit approach helped, but if there was lots of legislation coming out at one time, it would be nice to have slightly more resources. But yes, fundamentally we've got staff at the moment that could cover the most basic of new legislation. Yes,
that's great, thank you. With the wide availability of online retail for these products, is there recognition of the differences between physical retail in stores and online virtually? And what are the challenges this presents to aligning standards?
By that, do you mean the difference between accessibility of products at retail level?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you order vaping liquid online, you have to tick a box that says that you're over 18 or whatever it might be.
Yes.
But, a 10-year-old could tick that box.
Yes, it's you're at the multinational store level, their systems are excellent, there's no doubt about that. You've got age verification policies, their payment systems can check whether the card has been issued to someone over 18, so you've got some quite advanced technologies. At the lower level, bearing in mind you could shop anywhere in the world almost with some of these things, there'll be no age verifications. It will boil down to just something as the purchaser just ticking a box. So Can we regulate the internet? Not really, not from our office anyway. Can we speak to people on the island that have websites? Of course, yes, we have had some interactions in the run up to the vaping ban and the application of age warnings and things like that on websites. But yes, the difference between what we can do at retail level by going in and visiting is dramatically different from what we could realistically achieve with online sales. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass over to the Chair now.
Thank you. You mentioned in your submission to us about consideration being given to a fixed penalty notice system, and I just wanted to explore that a little bit. Do you think it would be feasible to introduce a fixed penalty notice system here? Would that help control sales of underage products?
The system that I've worked under previously was fairly straightforward from tobacco and nicotine vaping. It allowed the application of a fixed penalty fine of £200 for the sale of the product. It would be discounted down to £150 if it was paid within 14 days, but they had 30 days to pay that. The Trading Standards Officer and Department had the decision to decide whether or not that fixed penalty was issued to just the retail seller on the day or to the management or the owner of the store based on training records and stuff like that. So these are fairly straightforward enforcement duties for the team to follow. Obviously the current team haven't been used to working under them, but I have. The second stage to the fixed penalty would be if the same person in business sold again, the fine doubled. And then if it happened again, the fine would double one more time, and then you'd be looking at a banning order. So that would be the very basic principles of a fixed penalty system. The main benefits obviously is it would reduce court burdens, reduce court time. It would allow interaction between the department to regulate, control and alter bad behaviours. So from that point of view, I do think it would be beneficial. But and it would also rule out the possibility of long, lengthy investigations and possibly been duty bound to take a prosecution for fundamentally a first offence, very small fine. So yes, it definitely has benefits. It's something that the committee may wish to consider for this particular scenario, because it does speed up enforcement and it allows matters to be dealt with quite quickly, very efficiently, and I've found it very effective in the past. Very, very rarely have I ever got to the stage where a second fixed penalty was issued. And it's happened on occasion, but it's very rare. It's usually only exactly the type of premise you would really want to take quick action with, and it allows them to get a sort of staged progression towards the possibility of not being allowed to sell the products because they haven't managed to make corrective action to the steps taken against them. So I think it would definitely be something I think would be worthy of consideration.
Does the OFT have the power to issue fixed penalty notices for any other?
No.
Okay, so what legislative changes would be required to enable that, if that was something we went down? Is this primary legislation, or is it an amendment of regulations for the OFT that we would need to amend?
Probably need to get back to you with a wee report on that side of things, on exactly how that would be achieved. But that could be done in the timescales of the committee. So.
Right. Yeah, I think that would be helpful, because if this is something that it feels like it's an easy touch, but it might be helpful to consider how we would bring that into effect and have a bit more evidence around that, if that's okay.
I could certainly take that away and get back to you on that.
Thank you, that would be helpful. Stu.
Proxy sales. In your submission to the committee, you identified a problem with proxy sales involving both vaping and tobacco products in the Isle of Man. I think most of us are aware of children hanging about outside tobacconists or off licences trying to get booze or cigarettes, and now probably vaping fluid. If there was to be a fixed penalty notice system introduced in relation to proxy sales, would there be an obligation to ask everybody that's trying to buy tobacco or nicotine products who the end user or consumer of it is going to be? No, I don't think that. You mean at retail level? Yeah.
No, I wouldn't envisage that. I've not encountered that scenario, but we do get a lot. Even in my time here, we've had retailers complaining that they do get a lot of pressure outside shops. There's children gathering. They're asking adults outside. So a lot of good retailers on the island highlight that to us. But no, I wouldn't see any duty placed on the retailer to ask who the end user was. But I do think, again, educational work. In my previous roles, there's been some fairly telltale signs that retailers can look out for. Perhaps an adult with a lot of small change collected from people outside, a lot of coins, maybe ordering multiple products in the same line, different flavours, or maybe even with a pre-written list of an order and things like that. So yes, no, most retailers are very proactive when it comes to trying to prevent proxy sales.
Is there a viable and feasible way of proxy sales of tobacco and nicotine products being stopped or reduced even further?
Education. I think it would need to be, if there was a fixed penalty introduced, then it would be about education and the dangers and warning adults that buying these products for people under 18 carries with it a fixed penalty or a criminal offence. So that's something we could do at retail level. That's,
and how could you sort of monitor that? If proxy sales are taking place within the private sector, how could it be monitored and identified as being a problem?
It's very difficult, that there's no doubt about that. I mean, I did a survey once. It was in Scotland. Some schools had police officers on campus periodically to liaise with children and stuff like that. We issued a questionnaire to them. We administered it. I was one of the people that helped administer it. We just went through about 10 questions, and we asked the children how they got the products, where they came from, and the proxy sale was the #1 source by far, whether it be a big brother or sister or a family member or strangers. And that was one of the things that alarmed the parents, was the thoughts of their children hanging around places and speaking to unknown adults and requesting to get these products. So short answer, very difficult to prove, very difficult to identify, but I genuinely believe it's the #1 source for people under the age limit of the product get it as a proxy sale. They know someone that will buy it for them. So.
All right. Well, talking about generational sales, if a generational ban was to be in place on the purchase of tobacco and nicotine products on the Isle of Man, would we see a rise in the level of proxy sales, do you think?
You would have to think in the short term. You would have to. I have no facts to back that up. I would need to do some research into that to actually deliver a backed up reason, but you would think, just on the basis of logic, that if there was an age, and as the age moved away and people perhaps had been smoking slightly under that age would be constantly in front of them. So you would imagine they would be constantly underage, and from that point of view, if they had reached addiction levels to the product or formed a habit or a social situation that they were buying these products, then yes, you would imagine that would be the case. So.
Okay, Ms Farragut.
Thank you. When we debated this in the House of Keys Tobacco and Nicotine Products Bill, one of the concerns I raised was the emergence of a black market in tobacco products. So could you give us any information on whether there's currently a black market for tobacco and nicotine products, containing products, on the Isle of Man currently?
We surprisingly get very little complaints about that side of things. I would have expected more. In my previous role in Scotland, the trading standards was maybe more predominant in the public's mind to contact trading standards about these things. But I believe on Island Customs and Excise probably get more information about that than trading standards in the Office of Fair Trading. So that's something I could look into and find out about if we're not consulted them already. But no, surprisingly little correspondence on that. In fact, none in my time here, and I've discussed it with the team to see if they can recall complaints coming in. They've all got personal opinions on what's going on in and around Ireland, but as far as the office concerns and statistics and any cases or examples that I could bring to you, I don't have any. It's surprisingly low.
Okay, that's interesting. So I suppose my second question was about how the OFT engages with stakeholders or partner agencies in these sorts of potential black market activities. One of the things that you've mentioned is Customs and Excise. Do you have much contact with them or the constabulary about these issues? Do they ever report back to you if they have these sorts of activities? Or
We share information, we speak to each other. If, for example, one of those parties decides, gets information that there may be a shop selling tobacco that doesn't meet requirements, it's maybe not labelled properly, we'd maybe pass that on or speak to each other. But as far as the volume goes, it's very, very low. It's just we do joint visits with Customs and Excise for different reasons to different public houses on the island and stuff like that. But as far as tobacco or vaping products being the lead reason for working together, I've not had any examples of that in my time here. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Back to me. The starting point for me asking to bring through the private members bill that's led to this committee was actually looking at legislation in other jurisdictions. Primarily New Zealand moved to a generational ban first and then abandoned it for tax reasons. And the UK are obviously heading down that pathway as well. Just considering though, I mean, we potentially could be out of step with other Crown dependencies. Do you have any sort of level of engagement between yourself and the trading standards bodies in the Channel Islands around any sort of joint challenges, particularly around tobacco or nicotine?
Not presently, no, not that I'm aware of. I mean, if we were introducing new legislation and we were looking at new ideas and things like that, we'd probably look at their website, see what their current issues are, and maybe approach them if we seen a common area of concern or something that somebody had done first and we could learn for. We'd definitely do that. But no sort of day-to-day or year-to-year proactive talks at the moment about anything.
Okay, and I'm guessing that if you're in the Channel Islands, the proximity of France and continental Europe brings additional challenges that you don't see here. Do you see any cross-border challenges for the Isle of Man, particularly in relation to our connectivity across the Irish Sea?
My slight concern, as I touched on earlier, would be that if we don't have strong, robust legislation that brings us in line with other markets and countries, then we may see products coming here that are deemed unsafe or unfit for sale elsewhere. And that would, if we didn't have the legislation, there wouldn't be much we could do about that. But I don't see anything right now that's causing any great concerns. But yeah, long term, as things change around the world, around the EU and in the UK, if their standards were to increase and ours were to stay the same, then yes, that would be a concern. So.
The proposal for the bill actually came in three parts. One was about looking at those next generational tobacco-based products, which we've already touched on with heated tobacco, and you said about that it's kind of changing market and strengthening the legislation around that. And it sounds from the evidence that you've given today that that's something that you would possibly agree needs a bit of future-proofing. The second was looking at the control of nicotine-containing products, and from your comments today about the vapes and the construction of vapes and the size of the reservoir and the concentration of nicotine, that's a gap that we currently have in our current legislative framework. And then the third part was a generational ban, which I think is something that the politicians will argue, and it's why we're looking into all of the aspects of this within this committee. It's sounding like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from the evidence we've had today, that tightening up the regulations around the existing sales of both nicotine and tobacco products are something that you can see the necessity for, and do you think that in itself would cause very much more work for you in terms of dealing with those extra restrictions?
No, I don't think you would call it significantly more work. I think it would be educational. I think once the new proposed regulations were in place and we could prepare literature and give advice, we've had scenarios where obviously we've banned the display of vapes, which hadn't happened in the UK, so we have had multinational companies having to make the regional changes for the Isle of Man, so we're used to dealing with that side of things. If we did something first that was ahead of the time, or we came up with our own regulations, then yes, we're used to dealing with that side of things. I don't think it would be significantly more work, but I would want to do it in a professional manner where we produced quality literature, maybe even adapted our own website and had a sort of sort of drop-in type page where people could download and print the materials that was necessary to cover any changes and advise their staff. People who may be working in the retail point of sale, and just genuinely do a thorough job of it. If it was complex, if some of the proposed legislation that we're talking about, where you've got people who are purchasing the products to sell in the shops and they need advice, especially if they are shopping abroad, they might be buying stuff and bringing it to the island. So yeah, once we prepared the materials, I think it would be not hugely resource full requirements placed on the department, but yes, the work would be done at the start to implement the new legislation. So and then we would proceed with a series of visits to the premises and handing out the materials, and then ideally they would contact us thereafter for educational visits on this, the slightly more difficult stuff to digest about tank sizes and labelling of products and things like that, so that should they look to buy products out with the island and they're shopping abroad to sell in their premises, they've got the correct advice to meet the Isle of Man market. So.
Okay, and it sounds from your experience in just implementing the vaping bill that actually that three-pronged approach, which I'm taking was a planned strategy on the Office of Fair Trading's part, was, you know, on reflection, do you think that was absolutely the way to handle it, or would you have refined that further if, you know, now you've had a chance to look back at it?
It was quite simple in its planning. We had a good run-up. We knew when the dates were coming, so we advised them in advance. We gave out some literature and materials. We had some preliminary chats so that they were aware. Particularly at the smaller retailers level, you don't want knee-jerk reactions and people spending thousands of pounds on cabinets that they don't need. Mm-hmm. There was some very simple questions right at the start that helped people just relax and realise what they had to do. So much so that through the journey, some shops only made the changes the night before. If you'd gone in the day before, you wouldn't have realised that there was something, you know, significant happening the next day. And then the following day you went in, you just couldn't see any vapes. It was as simple as that. So the approach we took was designed to catch every type of retailer, from the multinational down to the sole trader. We treated everyone the same. They got educational visits well in advance of the proposed date. They got the follow-up visit just before to make sure that implementation was likely, and then obviously the enforcement check after that, just to make sure we had compliance. So to answer your question, I don't think we would really change that, to be honest. If there was a register perhaps and we had lots of contact details and things like that, maybe in the future we could do more by email, electronically, engage with them and offer them the chance to contact us. But in advance of the legislation that came out last year, we had to effectively map the island and find out all the retailers that sell these products, because we didn't have a register. So we went round, we looked for the places that were most realistically likely to be sold, and we mapped and we just made up our own list, and we asked them to, you know, give us the details and consent to being part of a small list in our office to allow us to communicate with them in the short term with any changes and information, and it worked very well. So
and just to clarify, the time frame between the legislation being passed in Tynwald and then coming to effect for the display ban was how long?
I'd need to check my notes to see exactly how long that was, but it was more than enough. There was plenty of time. Okay. This was, I think, again, I know I've said it repeatedly, but I think because the tobacco legislation came first, there really wasn't a lot of head scratching over this. It was there was minor differences between the tobacco and the vaping and the way the display ban was implemented, and there was companies that had offices in the United Kingdom. They were used to again just slight differences in the way it was implemented, but we were able to deal with that and well in advance give the advice.
So if we're considering recommending changes, that time frame probably needs to broadly match, because that seemed like that's manageable for the Office of Fair Trading and for the retails.
The only thing I would possibly point out would be that sometimes when you bring changes to the products, you need to allow more consideration should be given to the retailer to sell out old stock. Or in the vaping situation, we had cases in the UK where people were allowed a period to return them to the wholesaler that they bought them from. Therefore, you know, independent and small businesses didn't lose. They had time to get their old stock sent back to where it came from. So yeah,
I think we had something similar when we were talking about the single-use plastic legislation and how many spoons companies were holding, for example, at the point where we said you can't have any more plastic spoons. So there obviously needs to be some management around that. Thank you very much. Is there anything that we haven't asked about today which you feel is relevant that you'd like to share with us?
Just going through my sort of notes at the end. Would the committee like any particular engagement on perhaps some retailer feedback? I know it touched on that, but would it be of interest to know how retailers feel about any proposals or any of the things that we've discussed? Would there be any desire to have a little bit of feedback, even just down to the simplicity of how they felt sales and the implementation of the display ban went from their point of view?
I think that would be helpful. We have had some contact from retailers already that have seen discussion about this. But if obviously with your connections and your contact with them, if there's any information that they would like to submit to the committee, if you can please ask them to write to us, that would be brilliant.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Not from me, thank you.
No. In which case, all it remains for me to do is to thank you for your time and for coming along to talk to us today. And the committee will now sit in private.